If you've been following my podcast for a while, you've probably heard of the 4% rule. Retire with $1 million, start with a $40,000 distribution in year one, adjust every year for inflation thereafter, and you're set for 30 years. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, Bill Bengen, the guy who invented the rule back in the 90s, just released his new book, Richer Retirement, and even he says the 4% rule might be a little too low. So is it time to ditch it? Should it be the 7% rule? In today's episode, we're going to talk about the background of the 4% rule. We'll talk about some of the updates that he's made to the rule with this new book. Then we're going to talk about some of the downsides of the 4% rule and also some practical approaches as you think through your own retirement income plan. First, for those of you who are new, welcome. My name is Kevin Lau. I'm your host of the Planning for Retirement podcast, and I'm also the owner and financial planner at Imagine Financial Security. We help individuals that are approaching retirement with over 7 figures saved, maximize their retirement spending, minimize their lifetime tax bill, and worry less about money. If that describes you, make sure to follow our podcast and also make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel where we put out weekly retirement-related content specifically designed for you, PFR Nation. Speaking of YouTube, I just put out a new YouTube video about the Affordable Care Act premium tax cliff. So if you are retiring before Medicare eligibility, so before you turn 65, it's very likely you're going to look for some kind of healthcare solution. And the most popular option is buying a policy on the exchange or healthcare.gov, formerly known as Obamacare. Well, the sticker price when you go to the exchange and shop for policies is real. The premiums are super high. However, you might be surprised at the amount of money you could receive in tax credits if you control your modified adjusted gross income. Well, there are some major changes coming on the pipeline in 2026. If you are buying an ACA policy, you're definitely going to want to check that YouTube video out. So just go check out the Whiteboard Fireside Chat playlist on my YouTube channel, and I hope you find that one helpful. Okay, so let's talk about the background of the 4% rule. So, you know my feelings about the 4% rule. I've always thought it was simply a benchmark, just looking at this one, and actual doing real retirement income planning with real people. I know the 4% rule should not be followed in a vacuum, but many people who are casually reading about retirement planning will kind of take 4% as the gospel. But let me just break down what it is. Essentially, what Bill did, what he attempted to do back in the 90s was figure out a worst case scenario where a retiree started a withdrawal percentage of their portfolio, his or her portfolio, and wanted to adjust that withdrawal percentage by inflation every year. He wanted to figure out what is the worst case scenario. What is that starting 4% rule where the portfolio was not depleted within 30 years? So 30 years was his criteria, and he back tested all the way back, I think, to 1926. And what he found was many retirees retired with a much higher rate of withdrawal than 4%. However, 1968, the fall of 1968, at the beginning of 2 bear markets in a period of 4 years and hyperinflation in the 70s and 80s, the 4% starting withdrawal rate in 1968 still held up for 33 years. Okay. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the 4% rule is year one, let's say you're starting with $1 million. That first withdrawal will be 4% of that, which is $40,000. And let's say after year one, inflation was, let's say 3%. So that's $1,200 you would add to that first year withdrawal. So in year two, you would then take out $41,200 and so on and so forth throughout your life expectancy. So it is meant to be a worst case scenario. So for those of you who are pessimists out there, if you're like, hey, I could retire in the worst case scenario, or right now, 2025, we're on the heels of potentially a depression or another great recession. Maybe this would give you peace of mind is that, there's never been a scenario where if you started with 4% that you ran out of money if your time horizon is 30 years or more. Okay. Well, with his new book, Richer Retirement, which I've not read, by the way, and, I'm kind of on the fence of whether or not I'm going to read it just because I've already kind of got some snippets from others who have read it. But essentially what he did is he wanted to add some asset classes. So one of the key points to note about the initial 4% rule study was that he simply used 2 asset classes, which is fine as, because you got to use some assumptions. So we put in 2 asset classes, 50% in the S&P 500, or what I would consider to be large cap US stocks, and then 50% in intermediate treasuries. Okay. I think it was 10-year bonds, but I heard him say in an interview it was 5-year treasury. So I'm not really sure. It's either 5-year or 10-year treasuries was that initial study. And 50-50 was the target, 50% in each of those asset classes. Well, in his new research, he added more asset classes. He added mid-cap stocks. He added small-cap stocks, micro-cap stocks, international stocks, and then some other bonds within the fixed income portfolio. So that same retiree in 1968 could have actually started with a 4.7% rate of withdrawal and still lasted beyond that 30-year time horizon. So basically kind of the overall messaging was 4% was probably too low. Even 4.7% held up pretty well. But one of the quotes that I took away in one of his interviews recently, because all the financial publications are now interviewing Bill, coming off the heels of his new book, is that he thinks 5.25 to even 5.5% could be a pretty reasonable starting rate of withdrawal today. Okay. So even the 4% rule guy says 4% is too low. Okay. Which I don't disagree with at all. Because there are some downsides. There are some major downsides of just following the 4% rule in a vacuum. The first one, you've heard me talk about this, but it ignores other income sources like Social Security income or perhaps a pension. Okay. Which ultimately, when those begin, probably will reduce pressure on your rate of withdrawal for the duration of your retirement from that point forward. So let's say, hypothetically, you did retire early. Let's say you retired around the age of 60. You're not even eligible to start Social Security. So, but let's say you plan to delay Social Security until 70. So that would be the bridge period from age 60 to 70, where you need to rely solely on your investment portfolio, assuming you have no pension or no other income sources. Well, that 10-year bridge period, your rate of withdrawal might be a little higher. Okay, then sort of significantly higher than 4%. So let's say you needed $100,000 from your portfolio and you've got $1.5 million saved up. Well, if you take $100,000 in simple math, ignoring taxes or anything along those lines, and you divide that in to $1.5 million, that's about a 6.67% rate of withdrawal, much higher than the initial 4% starting withdrawal. Okay. Now, certainly it might put pressure on that portfolio in that first 10 years. And, no one has a crystal ball. You don't know what kind of markets you're going to retire into. If you retired into markets, let's say from 2015 to 2025, you probably did much better than a 6.67% average rate of return. So your portfolio actually may have grown in that 10-year period versus, let's say you perhaps retired in 2000 and that lasted until 2010, that bridge period. Well, that's the lost decade. It's most likely because you went through the dot-com bust, you went through the Great Recession. It's more than likely that your portfolio actually was significantly depleted during that 10-year period if you were following that rate of withdrawal. But after 10 years, after that bridge period, let's say then your Social Security kicks in, and let's say that's going to pay you $50,000 a year. Well, now you may only need $50,000 to supplement your Social Security income, and therefore your rate of withdrawal may go down or should go down quite substantially. So I think that's an important thing to take into consideration, is that the timing of your income sources is going to impact the amount you need from your portfolio at different stages. And it's more than likely that at the beginning phase of retirement, your rate of withdrawal might be a little higher. Okay. And we'll talk about more of that in just a second. But the second part is tax efficiency. The 4% rule essentially assumed all of the assets, all of the nest egg for retirement, they're sitting inside of tax deferred vehicles like 401ks or IRAs, which is, fairly common. I wouldn't say it's across the board these days with folks retiring, but it's fairly common to have at least the majority of the assets in tax deferred accounts. But you might have some Roth accounts. You might have some accounts inside of an HSA. You may even have a taxable brokerage account, and you can leverage the tax benefits of that taxable brokerage account. So I think this idea that if you optimize your tax efficiency in retirement, which we've talked about a lot of those strategies on this podcast over and over and over again, that could absolutely boost your rate of withdrawal well above whatever benchmark you're using, whether it's 4% or 4.7% or even the 5.25%, 5.5% benchmark rate of withdrawal. Okay. And as you can see, he's throwing out many different ranges. So there's no one size fits all. It depends on many, many factors. The third thing, though, I want to point out, in sort of on the same lines of, your rate of withdrawal might be a little higher early on because of the timing of income sources. Well, that may also be the case because of this idea of the spending phases. I'm really a big fan of breaking down your retirement spending into 3 distinct phases. Your go-go years, which is that honeymoon phase of retirement. You're probably doing a lot more of the bucket list travel or taking golf trips in that first 10-year period. And then at some point, no one has a crystal ball in terms of how long your health is going to be in good shape. But at some point, you may start to slow it down a little bit. So that would be considered the slow go years. And then at some point, you're going to enter and go through the no-go years more than likely. And ultimately, your family's going to visit you. You're not going on any planes. You're not taking any more of those bucket list trips. So what I see in my practice and with our clients that have been retired for some of them 10, 15 years is that they do go down this gradual reduction of spending over time for their lifestyle expenses. Now, what I will say is there's always the uncertainty that healthcare costs could ramp up at the end phase of retirement in those no-go years or even in the slow-go years. So how do you accommodate for that? Obviously, you've got insurance, you've got Medicare, you've got some supplemental health insurance coverage. However, what if you need long-term care? We know that Medicare is not going to cover long-term care costs. So you're either going to be paying out of pocket for those costs, or you're going to be buying insurance, or you're going to be doing some sort of combination of the two. So that is very critical to note, is that you need to factor in that end-of-life healthcare cost, but in general, for your discretionary spending, oftentimes will actually go down throughout retirement. In fact, there was a study that Morningstar did many years ago, and they basically came to the conclusion that retirees on average lag inflation by about 1% per year. So take that for whatever you will. Another downside of the 4% rule is that it is based on an overly conservative asset allocation of 50% stocks, 50% bonds. And this was actually pointed out in Bill Bengen's initial study back in the 90s, as he said, again, we're using that worst case scenario. He's also using the lowest acceptable percentage of stocks that he recommends. And I think this is very important because, and I've talked about this on the podcast, that these old benchmarks of like, own your age in bonds. So if you're 60, you own 60% of your portfolio in bonds. He was really the first one to come out and say that's probably not appropriate, because if you're planning for a 30-year time horizon of retirement, let's say from age 60 to age 90, you're going to need to protect against inflation risk. So the best way to do that is not by owning a ton of bonds, but actually by owning stocks. So the higher percentage you own in stocks, the more you can combat inflation risk, which also goes hand in hand with longevity risk. So his recommendation was minimum 50%. However, he advocated for as close to 50% to stocks as possible. And in a lot of those scenarios, that 75% stock exposure, 25% bond exposure, oftentimes the initial rate of withdrawal was much higher than 4%. It was 5, 6% or even more. Okay. So really important to think through your risk tolerance, but also your risk capacity. Perhaps you're in a situation where you have won the game. Maybe you've oversaved for retirement. You don't need to swing for the fences. You don't even need to take on 50% exposure in the stock market. And if it's going to give you that peace of mind to actually reduce your equity exposure way down to 50 or way down to 40 or even 30% in equities, and your plan is still successful, well, you have the right to choose that. On the flip side, if you're kind of borderline, if you're barely funded and you have a minimum required rate of return of, let's say, 5.5 or 6 or 6.5% a year, you might need 60% minimum equities, maybe even closer to that 75% target that Bill had mentioned in that initial study. So again, that 4% rule assumes that most conservative allocation of 50-50, whereas I find a lot of the clients that we serve, they're much closer to the 60-40 benchmark or even 75-25 equity bond exposure. And then the last one, I've mentioned this before, the downside is it is based on the worst case scenario, not the average case. So again, 4% rule, that initial study, adding those other asset classes, 4.7%. But again, this is based on the worst case scenario, a retiree starting in 1968. And, at the end of the day, no one has a crystal ball. You don't know what kind of markets you're going to retire into. But listen to this. The average rate of withdrawal in that initial study across all retirees, drum roll on this one, was 7%. So instead of 4%, we're talking, instead of $40,000 that first year, $70,000 starting rate of withdrawal was the average retiree experience through all of those rolling 30-year periods that he tested from 1926. So I don't know about you, but I'd probably rather not plan for the worst case scenario. I definitely want to have a backup plan. Like if we went through a 1968 type of start for your retirement, you probably want to have some other levers to pull, potentially going back to work part-time or, potentially, tapping into Social Security a little bit earlier than you anticipated, potentially tapping into home equity. Okay. But I think this idea that you're going to plan in terms of when you're going to retire, when you're going to spend your go-go years and how much you're going to spend in those go-go years based on a worst case scenario, I don't think that really resonates with a lot of people because they'd much rather enjoy experiences than retirement versus leaving a big pile of money at the end. And that 4% starting rate of withdrawal oftentimes led to not only preserving the portfolio principal, but significantly increasing wealth throughout retirement, which again, may be important to you. Perhaps you do want to maximize legacy to the next generation. Perhaps you do want to maximize legacy to charity, but maybe not. Maybe you want to maximize your lifetime impact. Maybe you do want to give money to kids, but maybe instead of giving to them at death, you want to give some to them while you're alive. Maybe they're having families. Maybe they're buying homes. Maybe they're sending their kids to private school. Perhaps you do want to give some money while you're alive so you can actually see your family benefit from those funds. We call that giving with a warm hand versus a cold one. Or maybe you want to maximize, gifting money to charity. Well, you can do some of that during your lifetime as well. You don't have to just wait until you're dead for you to satisfy some of these wish list goals, in terms of what we like to call them. So again, I don't think people, at least the folks that we serve, want to plan for that worst case scenario. They certainly want to have a backup plan just in case, but they'd rather plan maybe closer to the average, maybe not the average, but maybe slightly below the average, but certainly above that worst case scenario. So my first takeaway for you out of all of this is that to know that, hey, the 4% rule is actually not a rule. It should just simply be a benchmark. And now, again, we're going to inflate that to now 4.7% because I do like the idea of coming up with more than two asset classes. And that's the reality of most portfolios that we're managing today. All the portfolios that we're managing today, to be truthful, have more than two asset classes. So if you add some of those other asset classes that do create more diversification and more downside protection during ups and downs in the markets, now we're closer to 4.7% as that benchmark. So it's a starting point. So once you run a financial plan and create a process to say, okay, what does that initial rate of withdrawal look like? Compare that to the 4% rule or the 4% benchmark and say, okay, hey, if you're doing 10% that first year, okay, maybe that's a little bit of a red flag. But if you're at maybe 5.5 or 6%, and you're sitting there at 60 years old and in 7 years at full retirement age, you're going to begin Social Security, or in 10 years, you're going to begin Social Security, and that's going to drop your rate of withdrawal well below 3% or 2%. You need to factor that in. You need to take that into consideration because I'd hate for you to continue to work years and years and years longer than you really need to, when in fact you could go ahead and pull the trigger and start enjoying retirement now. Because again, nobody has a crystal ball in terms of what their health's going to look like, how long those go-go years are going to look like. And so that's why I'm a big fan of not underspending in those go-go years, because we don't know how long those are going to last for. The second takeaway for you is optimize your plan from a tax efficiency standpoint. Okay, I'm not saying if you have all of your assets in tax deferred vehicles, I'm not saying just convert them all to Roth today, or I'm not saying, cancel all of your tax deferred contributions and move them all Roth. What I'm saying is thinking about the timing of those distributions. Perhaps when you retire, okay, let's say maybe that is 60 years old. Well, at 75, that's going to be when you're required to take distributions out of those tax deferred accounts. So you might have a 15-year period of what I like to call the Roth conversion window, which is essentially a period of time where your tax brackets are much lower, that you can begin filling up those lower brackets, filling up the 10%, the 12% bracket, or even the 22% bracket, knowing that at some point later on down the road, if you don't do that, now you're going to be pushed into potentially the 24% bracket or 32% bracket, okay? Or being subject to income-related monthly adjustment amount, surcharges on your Medicare premiums, okay? Taxation on Social Security. So just think about the timing of when your tax brackets might be lowest and the timing of when your tax brackets could spike during retirement to try to smoothen that tax liability for a longer period of time, as opposed to running into those tax traps during retirement. And again, if you implement a tax efficient strategy, what we found in our practice and our research, you could absolutely add more value in the form of minimizing your lifetime tax bill and also maximizing and sort of enhancing your legacy at the end of your lifetime, if that is important to you. The third thing I really want you to think through is this idea of risk tolerance versus risk capacity. Okay. Again, we're looking at, let's kind of use this range of 50 to 75% in equities. You need to stress test your plan, because obviously the lower percentage you have in equities, the lower expected rate of return you're going to experience in retirement. Okay. That's just the idea of risk reward trade-off. Whereas the higher exposure into equities, the more volatility you might experience, but the longer term rate of return is going to be improved. So you need to figure out how much risk you need to take, how much risk is required for you to take in order to achieve your retirement goal. Okay. And this does involve some financial planning tools and software. But ultimately, once you figure that out, then you can look at this and say, hey, do I have the tolerance to take on that kind of risk? Maybe you only need to take on 50 or 60% in equities in order to achieve your retirement income goal. That means you probably oversaved and have done a good job managing expenses. Well, then you can make a decision. Do you want to take on more risk because that could enhance what's left over that you can give to your children? Or do you want to potentially reduce the amount of risk you're taking because that allows you to sleep better at night? But once you come up with that global asset allocation target, let's say it is 60-40. Okay, I'll use that most popular benchmark that a lot of retirees think about when they think about investing is 60% in equities, 40% in fixed income. Well, what you can do is you can sort of look at your different buckets, your taxable bucket, your tax deferred bucket, and your tax free bucket. And you can kind of think about the time horizon in which you might start taking those withdrawals. So again, using the example of someone who's 60 years old, maybe in that first 10 or 15 years during that bridge period, maybe they're tapping into the taxable brokerage account first. So maybe that account's a little bit more conservative because they're going to be rating that account first. And maybe that second line of defense is not going to start until another 10 or 15 years once they start requiring minimum distributions or once their taxable brokerage account is completely exhausted. So maybe that tax deferred bucket has a little bit more risk in there, has a little bit more equities in that portfolio. And then bucket number 3 is that tax-free account that they plan on essentially leaving to their kids or maybe tapping into at the end of their life. Maybe that's the account that's most aggressive. So you can kind of think about your assets in terms of buckets and then sort of have a different investment strategy across those different buckets to still achieve that global asset allocation target you're trying to achieve, but breaking it down in terms of, aligning it with the time horizon in which those withdrawals are going to start, which each of those buckets. What I would caution you that on that one though is if you do have a larger brokerage account, taxable brokerage account, maybe your brokerage account's $1 million. Okay. If you're targeting that account to be really conservative and have a lot of those bonds in that portfolio, it could create a little bit of a tax drag in your overall financial plan. Okay. Because again, a lot of those bonds, most likely they're going to be taxable bonds, and that's going to add a lot of a tax drag on your return. So you really need to take that into consideration is you probably don't want to overload bonds in that taxable brokerage account. You want to have a nice mix of bucketing and what we call asset location. Another consideration that I'd highly encourage you to think through is this idea of guardrails. And this is something that we have talked about on the podcast. It's been a little while, so maybe it's a topic I refresh. But essentially, guardrails was actually a study that was kind of done, I think it was in the early 2000s by Guyton and Klinger. And essentially, it was sort of an improvement of the 4% rule, sort of knowing that, hey, 4% is a static number. You start with the 4% number, whatever that is. Let's say it was that $40,000 on $1 million. And then you simply adjust that by inflation every year. So you kind of throw out that percentage, after that first year rate of withdrawal. And you're never making any adjustments. However, guardrails sort of gives you a little bit more permission to spend more in that portfolio on the front end. Probably increase that by 20 or 25% starting rate of withdrawal, depending on the amount of risk you're taking in the portfolio. And then having some rules in place to know that, hey, if things go bad with the portfolio, when to cut your spending. Or on the flip side, if things are going well, when to increase your spending, when to give you that raise. So I think guardrails is a great plan if you're kind of borderline funded, or maybe you're retiring super early. Maybe you're retiring at 55 and you potentially have a 40-year time horizon that you're planning for. You may go through some bumps and bruises with your investment portfolio, but you don't want to skimp in those go-go years. So you're kind of weighing, sort of this, enjoying retirement now, enjoying the go-go years, while at the same time being concerned that, hey, I need this to last 40 years. Implementing guardrails could really give you a little bit more permission to spend more in those go-go years, knowing that, hey, if things go bad, you probably need to cut your discretionary spending for a short period of time to allow your portfolio to recover. So guardrails is a great strategy to consider. And the final recommendation on this one is really think through your long-term care plan, because that can really blow up any good retirement income, any good withdrawal strategy in retirement. Because, let's say you did start with a higher rate of withdrawal. Maybe you did start with that average 7% number and you increase that with inflation every year. Maybe it did okay for a while, but maybe you went through some rough patches later on in retirement, or maybe you had a long-term care need at the end of your life. How does that impact your plan? Or if you have a spouse and maybe your spouse has a much longer life expectancy than you do, how does that impact your spouse's ability to maintain their financial independence, to maintain their dignity in retirement? So what I find is by not having a long-term care plan, it can oftentimes lead to retirees underspending because they have this mindset of like, hey, they need to have a little bit of money left over to pay for that long-term care cost because, at the end of the day, the statistics are being thrown out there. It's, upwards of 70% of retirees are going to need some kind of care in their later years. You don't know how long that's going to last. You don't know to what extent you're going to need care, but 70% is a pretty good chance. So oftentimes what I see retirees that don't have a good long-term care plan, they do oftentimes have this fear of spending down the portfolio. So again, whether it's insurance or self-funding or some kind of combination of the two, having a game plan, I think, gives you a little bit more permission to spend down money in your retirement, in your go-go years, and really enjoy those go-go years, while at the same time making sure there's a dedicated pool of funds to give that caregiving spouse or give the caregivers permission to spend the money on care if you ever needed it. Because that's great if you're planning to self-fund, but does your spouse know that you're planning to self-fund? How much money do they have permission to spend down in the portfolio in order to pay for your care? If they don't have the answers to those questions, it can oftentimes lead for that caregiving spouse just to do it themselves, when in reality, they do have the budget to spend the money on care. So really be careful with this idea of self-funding and not telling anyone else. Have a game plan, but share that game plan, whether it's your spouse or some kind of power of attorney that you trust or a trustee, whoever that person might be that would step in and make those caregiving decisions. Make sure they also know your plan. So I guess the final question I'm going to ask you is the 4% rule dead? I don't think it's necessarily dead. I think it's just it's a solid benchmark. But now I think with the new book, Richer Retirement, and Bill Bengen's refreshed assumptions, I love it. The idea that he pushed that up to 4.7, but he even admitted, even a 5.25%, 5.5% starting rate of withdrawal is completely acceptable. Okay. And we're talking about a rocket scientist who is a brilliant mind that's done the research. So I trust what Bill Bengen's saying. And I would say absolutely 4.7, 5%, 5.5%. These are probably all still pretty conservative assumptions. And so I think the better question is, should we make it the 7% rule? Should 7% be the benchmark? Okay. Knowing that timing of Social Security is going to play a big factor, and assuming it's still there to some extent, maybe there are some cuts to Social Security in 10 or 15 years, but at least it's going to provide some kind of baseline income. I think that's a big factor, because at some point, maybe you do start with 7% early on, but maybe that only lasts for a decade. And then after a decade, then you pare back that rate of withdrawal. And even if you went through some downturns in the markets, that will allow your portfolio at that point to recover from that more aggressive spending during that first decade. So I really think that's super important to kind of think through all of these different variables and sort of also just kind of coming to grips with that. No one can predict the future. We can model all of this out in great financial planning software, but the key is ongoing implementation, having a disciplined, unemotional, repeatable process. Okay. And so these are super important things to not only set a plan for upfront in retirement, but also continue to monitor as you continue to go through retirement. Make sure to check out this week's YouTube video. So I'm actually going to look at what the 7% rule did over the last 10 years. So I actually did a little back testing using some portfolio analytics tools, and I stress tested $1 million portfolio. If they started with a 7% rate of withdrawal in year one, again, 10 years ago, what does the portfolio look like today? So make sure to check out the YouTube, subscribe to the YouTube, and that video is going to come out this Thursday. And listen, finally, like I mentioned earlier, this retirement planning deal, it's a complicated thing. And I understand that a lot of you listening to this podcast, or a lot of you are DIYers, or you've been DIYers for many, many years, if not decades. But if you are interested in getting a second set of eyes and you want to learn more about working with our firm, you can contact us, or you can reach us at www.imaginefinancialsecurity.com. Just go on our website. We'll share a little bit more about who we work with, how we do things, and then you can start with the retirement readiness questionnaire that is linked in our description. We'd love to learn more about you, your situation, what your goals are, and see how we can help you plan for and execute your ideal retirement. Thank y'all for tuning in. If you found value in this podcast, of course, make sure to follow, but also make sure to share this with someone else who is a PFR Nation type of caliber individual, someone else who is, let's say, over the age of 50, let's say they've already accumulated 7 figures or very close to that mark, and they're trying to figure out, hey, when can I fire my boss? When can I retire? When can I go, travel the world and play all the golf courses I want to play at? When can I just spend more time with my family, with my loved ones? Share this podcast with those individuals, because it really helps us reach and impact more people, which is our goal for this show. Thanks again for tuning in, and I will see y'all next week.